Now, I would like to hand it over to Shriya to take over the next section of the webinar.
Thanks, Nagalakshmi. So, following the panels, we now will be in conversation with Dee Jethva. She's a trained social worker with a master's in social work. She's also a safeguarding children specialist, and she has over 30 years of experience working in countries around the world. So, we have heard several opinions today about why we think the policy is important or what might be good for implementation. But I think it's great to hear from somebody who actually has seen these, this paperwork materialize, this policy actually take shape, and kind of just get insights from her experience. So I will be kind of in conversation with her and asking her a few questions that we discussed that we think might be helpful for everybody that is a part of this organization to know. But then if you also have any questions for Dee, you can leave them in the chat box and I can always ask her those as well. So welcome, Dee. To start off, I just kind of wanted to ask you why you think such a policy is important for WageIndicator, since you were instrumental in helping us design it. So why you think it's important for WageIndicator as a global online team to kind of have such a policy in place, and what after and what needs to be done along with just having the policy, to ensure that everybody feels safe.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, WageIndicator, for inviting me to this webinar. It's already been so fantastic. What an amazing, vibrant team you have, and already so well informed. So in answer to your question, Shreya, why should WageIndicator have a safeguarding policy? So WageIndicator, its mission is to really give information about helping organizations to ensure that whatever they pay their employees is sufficient to meet the needs of their cost of living. WageIndicator, in that sense, promotes rights of workers across the world. Safeguarding is very similar, to those kinds of rights. So it is a fundamental right of every individual, every human being, to have a right to safety and well-being. No individual should ever be subject to any kind of action that hurts or harms them. WageIndicator as an organization works across the globe. It employs individuals, and it also uses people that are engaging with the external world to gather the information that informs many platforms. In this work, it's really important for WageIndicator to communicate very loudly and very clearly what it expects from its employees in the way in which they behave, the way in which they represent the organization, and the way in which they conduct themselves. So WageIndicator has a duty of care to its staff and people that it engages with. And it needs to make sure that it doesn't place anybody in a situation of harm or risk of harm. Equally, everybody who works for WageIndicator or represents WageIndicator has a responsibility to make sure they do nothing that causes harm to any of their colleagues or causes harm to any of the people that they interact with. So organizations have a duty of care, and individuals have a responsibility. And those two things are very important because together they reduce the risk of harm in an organization. And a policy framework is a tool that communicates this expectation to everybody. That's why it's so important. And it's a reference point when anything occurs, because that's what you go back to see what's been breached and what's the action that you need to take.
Absolutely. I think that's very true. And I think it's great that we even have this webinar to kind of communicate that we do have a policy in place and actually make our interns and employees aware of the safeguarding framework that's in place. My second question is about the code of conduct one can kind of exercise in an online setting. Since we are interns, since we are employees of an online workspace, there is obviously a code of conduct that is a part of the policy, but if you could kind of talk about a few important things that we can keep in mind as interns to be safe before something were to happen. There are consequences, but there's always a way to kind of stay away or steer clear of those consequences as much as possible. So what, according to you, what are your tips for, staying online or safe online?
Thank you, Shreya. I think virtual working and remote working has transformed the workplace, and everybody is having to adjust to that. Some of your colleagues have already mentioned some of the incidents that they've experienced, and also, are experiencing is challenging in their organization. In principle, there's a rule of thumb. You should not behave in any way that you wouldn't if you were in a face-to-face situation. That's a rule of thumb. You should not do anything virtually that you wouldn't do to somebody if you were in a face-to-face situation. In terms of making sure that you are keeping safe and you are all behaving and interacting and communicating in a way that doesn't hurt or harm anybody, is to always observe the rules of virtual communication. So you don't post any rude messages in the chat box. You don't ignore somebody in a webinar who is trying to say and speak. So, whoever is moderating keeps a really close eye on how participants are interacting and wanting to say something. So, ignoring is a way in which you can actually just exclude somebody from a conversation, and it can then result in some form of a harassment later on. So you don't ignore people because of their gender, you don't ignore people because of their age, you don't ignore people because of their ethnicity. So any kind of diversity issue is something that you try and avoid. You are very mindful about the protocols of virtual communication. So when you're in a Zoom call, you observe and obey that. So you stay on camera if you're requested to do that, because you wouldn't physically turn your back into a meeting if you were that. So why would you turn off your camera unless you have internet issues? So that's important because it actually shows respect for the person who's organized it, respect for your colleagues, that you're all participating in this discussion together. In terms of just outside the virtual platform in communication for the workplace, how you behave, on the internet, in social media, is also very, very important. So it's about, not tagging somebody without their permission, not saying rude things about somebody, and it's called flaming in the internet world. So flaming somebody, so you're actually putting down their character in some shape or form. You should never ever be under pressure to send any kind of inappropriate image if you don't want to, because once an image leaves your device, it goes into the internet ether. And unless you have a very good provider who is willing to remove that image, it stays there forever. So, those kinds of things are really important. It's also really important as young people to be aware of, some of the barriers to reporting. And interns are a young group. They are at the start of their career. They don't want to do or say anything that might label them as a troublemaker. So they actually accommodate much more than they need to. And there is no need to do that. So it should be speaking up in a safe space is something that's very important and very critical. And as one of your colleagues said, that if you're accommodating inappropriate behavior, it's actually having an impact on your performance and your mental health. And that's never okay. So there are some of the things that I would say. So be always careful about how you communicate online. And the other thing that's important is virtual communication has also had a huge impact on global time zones and boundaries. So people are working from different time zones, and there's an expectation that you'll just be available at the convenience of somebody else's time zone, whereas it may not be suitable for your time zone. So I think that's also an important rule in virtual communication, that you organize it in such a way that you're actually respectful of everybody's time zones, and having boundaries around expectations of work and performance in relation to that.
Thank you. I think those are very insightful tips and very useful and very relevant to the kind of work we do every single day. And I kind of wanted to ask you a question that you did address in your speech, where you talked about the barriers that interns or employees face when they're reporting any kind of instances, and some of these could be breach of confidentiality, or anonymity is not maintained when you're kind of addressing the issue. And what are some of these kind of barriers that you've noticed, or that we need to keep in mind so we can kind of avoid them before they even occur, or kind of overcome them if they were to arise?
So I think one of the very good messages I heard from your senior management team is a culture of openness and a culture of receptiveness to reports. And that was very heartening, because you have leadership from the top that's actually driving this through the organization. And when you have that, you're likely to have very good arrangements in place to deal with reports. So people who receive reports are often very aware the person who's come forward has overcome a lot before they've made the report. So it's always important to remember that this person's had an internal struggle before they make the decision to make a report, because it's never easy. And I already identified a couple of barriers. People are afraid about career prospects. People are afraid of being labeled as a troublemaker. People are afraid they won't be believed. People are afraid that they'll be blamed. People are afraid that their information will be leaked and their confidentiality will be breached. So, these are some of the barriers that many workers experience in making a report. And then they're also, on the other side, they're also taking responsibility for what happens to the alleged perpetrator. That person might lose their job, or, they'll spread rumors about them, or they'll, alienate them. So, and if your safeguarding lead, is the person who receives this information, if they're aware of these barriers, they respond accordingly to the person who's made the report. And then they follow very quickly the procedures to deal with it. And when those procedures are clear and the matter is attended to as quickly as possible and it's resolved, it gives a very clear message in the organization that actually it's okay to make a report, because it's going to be dealt with, your confidentiality will be respected, and they will follow a fair, transparent process. And that's what really helps organizations to implement its safeguarding. And then once that message goes out, there is always a reduction in the risk of incidents happening. Incidents continue to happen in organizations where there is a belief that if you report, nothing happens. So perpetrators carry on. But if organizations do something very quickly and very swiftly, the message goes out, zero tolerance here. So, it makes a big difference.
So I think that is very true. And I think, as you mentioned, demonstrating a strong intent and just creating a culture of openness, I think would be two very, very important things to keep in mind when we're implementing the policy in the long run. I think those were three of my main questions that I had for you. And I think from my side, I'll close it off by just asking you if you have any message for all of us or everybody present on this call, from your experience as a safeguarding specialist. What do you think, kind of just a closing note?
My main message to any organization, any individual, is prevention. It's really important that you take every step to prevent harm from happening to you from a personal level, and an organization from an organizational level. And I've said organizations have a duty of care, individuals have a duty of responsibility. So you must not place yourselves in situations where there's a likelihood of harm. And organizations must put systems and procedures in place to ensure that you reduce risk of harm. That's very, very important. If you have a safeguarding policy in a code of conduct, everybody should read it, because it communicates the organization's expectations. It is not a defense if there's an allegation made against you to say, I didn't know. It's your responsibility to read it. So that will not be taken into consideration. I didn't know this was not allowed. Actually, you must read the code of conduct. That's the best way to prevent any allegation made against you, and the best way to know what's expected. And I would always urge every organization do everything possible to prevent incidents, because the aftermath of incidents is very costly. So that would be my message.
Thank you. I think that's a very powerful message and a very good closing note for our webinar as well. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure all of us kind of gain a lot of insights from the entire webinar and also just from your discussion with us. So I will now leave the floor open for any questions for Dee. And if you don't have any questions, then Nagalakshmi can take over to kind of close the evening. Okay, I'm assuming there's no questions, so Nagalakshmi, you can take over.
Yeah, sure. Thank you again, Dee, for answering those questions and for the great interaction. It was a pleasure having you with us. I would also like to thank everyone who were a part of this webinar and for giving us some crucial details and explaining the importance of the safeguarding policy. Also, I would like to thank all the participants for attending, and we hope you have learned a lot from this webinar and enjoyed it. Thank you all for taking out time and joining today's webinar. And that's it from my side. Hope you all have a great day.